They marched 3,000 miles through desert heat and starvation, fighting hand-to-hand combat along the way, and the entire time, they were singing hymns. Yes, they fought with their neighbors even before they left Europe. They drank from the stomachs of dead horses. They ate the bodies of the fallen. And when they finally reached the city that had been promised to them, they waded through the streets knee-deep in blood. And they called out the chilling words that they used to understand it all: Deus Vult. And if you ask them, they might just tell you, hey, we were just defending historically Christian land. This is the story of the First Crusade, one of the darkest and most morbid religious expeditions in human history. It was carried out in the name of Jesus Christ, and it was steeped in violence that still echoes across the world to this day. It begins with an empire on the brink of collapse, a pope who needed a miracle, and a single sermon that sent hundreds of thousands of ordinary people marching toward a city that most of them would have never otherwise lived to see. And what drove them? Was it the terrors of hell? Was it the idea that they were defending their homeland or defending the land of Christian people? Was it faith? Was it greed? Well, the answer is all of them, and also maybe none of them. And that is exactly what makes this story so impossible to understand, even 1,000 years later. Today, we are laying out the motives that ignited the First Crusade, the politics and the faith that drove them to it, and the sheer ambition that dominated it. So, sit back, relax, and welcome to History. What's up, people, and welcome back to History Camp. My name is Mark Gagnon, and thank you for joining me in my tent where every single week I explore the most interesting, fascinating, and controversial stories from around the world, from all time, forever, for always. Yes, that is what I do here in this tent every single week. Turns out it's the greatest job in the world, and I'm glad that you guys get to be along for the ride. Basically, I sit in here and I try to figure out everything that's ever happened. Every single minute, every day, history's going on, all right? Things are getting written down in history books for 10 years from now for us to read about. And it's happening all the time, and there's a lot of catching up to do. I only got here in the 90s, so there's thousands of years. And oh boy, today do we have a fascinating tale that kind of combines my interest in history and religion into one singular thing, as well as a little twinge of geopolitics, because I believe that the current political climate that we are in at this very moment as we are talking is similar to the Crusades in a lot of ways. I'll be honest, there's a kind of a Crusader-esque energy. Deus Vult, as I understand it, is currently tattooed on the bicep of the Secretary of War. Is that true, Christos?
I'll chat GPT.
Speaking of which, Christos, how are you, my friend? It's great to see you.
Doing so good,
That's
Mark.
okay, we don't need a whole thing from you. I'm sorry. So, today we're talking about the First Crusade. What is the First Crusade? I'm glad you asked. You probably heard the term before. You probably heard the words. You probably listened to the Geese song called Crusades, which is a fantastic song, I might add. It's just,
We're going to get copyrighted. You're
sorry.
doing it too good.
I appreciate that. Can you tell me what Hexeth's tattoo is? I'm pretty sure it is Deus Vult. He's got a couple of wild tattoos, but I think that's one of them.
Yeah. It's Latin for God wills it, first of all.
All right.
It became famous during the First Crusade,
Yep.
and there is no official word on whether or not that's tattooed on him.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was. Oh, my bad. But what does that mean? What does that mean for a guy that's currently, maybe or maybe not sending bombs over to Iran?
Well, why does God will it have anything to do with it?
I'm glad you brought that up. Let's discuss, all right? In order to understand the Crusades, we got to go to medieval Europe, like, by 1095 AD. It's crazy to think that, that was a year. 1095, you know?
Why?
Like, there's something about, 300 AD I can wrap my head around. And it's like, it's 300 years. The 1500s, I'm like, all right. But, there was a year that was, 1111. 1111 that year?
I'd imagine November 11th of that year.
It was a whole thing, I'm sure. It's just crazy. But anyway, in 1095, the Christian church isn't just like a church the way it is now. It is the organizing force of society. And it had just gone through one of the most catastrophic ruptures in history. Ugh, you know what I'm talking about.
What?
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. You ever heard of the Schism?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you have.
I'm part of it.
Yeah, Christos, you Greek traitor. Basically, things were tense at the time. Enemies were made, and it was this kind of atmosphere that sort of lays the foundation for the world leading up to the Crusades, right? The Great Schism, as you're familiar, it happened just decades prior in 1054 AD. And the Great Schism, if you don't know, which, make a note of that, we should do an episode on, it is basically when Christianity split into two. This is not the Reformation with Martin Luther. That's when the Christianity split into like 10,000. The schism is quite literally the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople. And they basically excommunicated each other. And so the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople were no longer speaking, which would be hard for them to speak that far anyway. They didn't have telephones. The world's attempt to establish Christendom, which again is this idea that Christians formed one singular body under God, that idea was gone. It was cracked officially. Now, meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire was in a lot of trouble. You see, the Byzantine Empire was the name for the Eastern Roman Empire. They were the great Christian civilization that had held the Eastern Front against invasion for centuries. They had been basically the buffer between Western Europe and the powers of the East, but in 1071, two things happened in that same year, and it changed everything. So first, you have what they call the Battle of Massacre. Now, basically, the Byzantine army was shattered by the Seljuk Turks, led by their Sultan Alp Arslan, who were, at the time, a new power out of Central Asia that had swept across Persia and Iraq and Anatolia and basically just destroyed everybody. Again, that could be its own episode, but just know that for backstory. Now, the Byzantine emperor, Romanos IV, was captured on the battlefield. And this is the first time that a Roman emperor had ever been taken prisoner by a Muslim commander ever. And as a result, the Seljuks flooded into Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and they basically carved away vast swaths of what had been Byzantine territory for literal centuries. So for what it's worth, Romanos' story didn't end there. He would then return to Constantinople, but he was, deposed and blinded and basically died of his injuries. His own people were less merciful than his captors, which is just a funny aside. And then in that same year, in a completely separate conflict, the Normans. If you've ever heard of the Normans, they are terrifying. They are the relentless descendants of the Vikings who had already conquered all of England, basically. They seized the last of the Byzantine territory in southern Italy. So, these two things happen back to back. Bang, bang. The empire is now bleeding. And it's taking on water from both ends, you could say. So by 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was a leader in crisis. He had been able to stabilize things a little, but he was, a capable administrator and a general, but no one can stop the situation. No one can retake Anatolia on their own. He needs soldiers, he needs money, you need all the things to go siege a city. So he did something that his predecessors would have considered unthinkable and honestly a little shameful. He sent ambassadors to a great church council being held in the Italian city of Piacenza, where Pope Urban II was presiding. It was March of 1095, and there, before the assembled clergy, his envoys made this formal appeal for military aid against the Seljuk Turks. His request was measured and honestly made a lot of sense. He needed mercenary soldiers, knights from the West who could help him push back the Seljuks. Now, it's important to note, he's not asking for a holy war. He's not asking for an army of God to rise up against the Muhammad people down in the Middle East that are coming up. It wasn't any of that at this point. He's just asking for help defending the Eastern Front, and what he got was something completely different. So, Emperor Komnenos' message gets to Pope Urban II. Pope Urban II, he's this French-born priest that then becomes the Pope, and he's educated and shrewd and, you could say, very aware of the church's vulnerabilities. He had been dealing with the fallout of the schism, and, now he has this rival pope basically installed by the Holy Roman Emperor. And now the general perception is that the papacy is weaker. So he's looking for something to reassert the church's authority and ultimately his authority. He needs this big project to unite the fractured nobility of Western Europe under this single banner. And now, obviously, this was a huge undertaking, right? You need this massive thing to basically reunite all of Christendom. But what made it worse is that Urban's political situation by 1095 was even more precarious than he might have thought. You see, for the better part of 30 years, the papacy had been locked in this bitter power struggle with the Holy Roman Emperors over a very simple question. Who gets to appoint the bishops? It seems small, but it had a massive conflict. I mean, the fallout from this was crazy. This is known as the investiture controversy, and it literally produced a rival pope backed by Emperor Henry IV. This forced Urban to basically operate out of southern Italy, almost like Pope in absentia, rather than Rome itself. It was a cluster, okay? So, with that said, The papacy and, Pope Urban needed a big win. But for Pope Urban, it wasn't just a religious opportunity. Maybe it wasn't a religious opportunity at all. It was just a political lifeline. And it's worth saying this idea of a military expedition to the east wasn't a new idea for Pope Urban. His predecessor, Pope Gregory VII, had tried to call for one twice and basically failed. Now, Urban himself had already been in contact with Alexios since at least 1089, quietly discussing the state of the two churches and possibility of Western assistance, and basically trying to form some type of alliance. So, when the formal appeal arrived at Piacenza, Urban was not hearing it for the first time. In some ways, he had been kind of waiting for this. So, in November of 1095, Urban calls this great church council in Clermont in central France, and thousands of people show up. I mean, you got bishops over here, you got some priests, some abbots, some lay people, and then on November 27th, at the end of the council, Urban delivers this sermon in an open field outside the city walls. No verbatim record of the speech still exists in its entirety. We have 5 separate accounts written by people who were present or knew about it, and they offer, different details, but they agree on the essential message. Now, just right off the bat, this speech was extraordinary. I mean, it's almost like Tenacious D level. This isn't even really a speech. This is just a tribute to the speech. That's how good the speech was. It's like it unified. It tapped into the exact feeling. Urban painted this picture of Christians suffering. He described these Seljuk Turks overrunning the holy places of the East and defiling churches and killing Christians and oppressing Christian pilgrims and enslaving Christians. He called on the Knights of Europe, men who had been fighting each other in all these local petty wars, who were bringing violence and chaos into their own communities, to turn that energy outward and go to Jerusalem and to liberate the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Jesus Christ himself, from those who had it. And in return, he promised something amazing. He says, hey, all of y'all are going to get a plenary indulgence. Yeah, everyone who made the journey with a sincere heart, according to Pope Urban, would receive full remission of their sins. A guaranteed golden ticket all the way to the top of the pearly gates. This is going to take you, according to the theology of the time, and still kind of now, basically out of purgatory or out of hell itself. You just get a free pass straight to heaven. And the crowd was basically like, yeah, that's sick as hell. We get to go kill a bunch of foreigners and we get to go to heaven for it. This is exactly what we've been looking for. So the crowd responds, and what would become the battle cry of the entire thing, which is God wills it. He's like, we're gonna go kill those people. God wills it. Christians are under attack. Yeah, God wills it. And we're gonna go murder them. We're gonna go get you up to heaven. Deus Vult.
And this is why it's important that Pete Hegseth has this tattoo.
You get it. You get it now, right? I mean, you got to think, this is why populations being in states of ideological or tangible suffering is dangerous, because you get them all together and you're like, hey, we've been getting shit on for a while, and you know what? We're not going to take it anymore. And guess what? We're going to find a way to justify this, because you got to think from Urban's perspective. He's like, dude, I'm going to get all these guys to pop over to the Middle East, fight a bunch of people, kill them. They're all going to unify. We're going to get all the young men in Europe at the time that are causing problems to get the heck out. They're going to go take care of themselves. Either they're going to go do our bidding or die. We're going to make our town safer, less wars in Europe, and they think they're going to heaven.
I wonder who gave him the idea to just lie to all the people.
Low key, he might have been telling the truth. I don't even know if it's a lie. That's the crazy thing. The indulgence stuff was risky business back in the day. The church, to my knowledge, I've never heard of it. I've been a Catholic my whole life. I don't know anyone that's ever gotten indulgence. I'm sure they exist in some type of small capacity with very, very strict parameters. But back in the day, during the Reformation times, you'd have people being like, hey, pay us $50. We'll get your uncle out of heaven. Come on. Or out of purgatory. Come on. It was that kind of stuff that doesn't make the church look great. But I'm saying 2,000 years of a Catholic church, you got 2 scandals. It's not bad.
Pretty big scandals. But
look, Penn State's been around 30 years and they got half the scandals. I'm just saying, we're not doing that bad, all right? I'm not trying to justify anything. I'm just saying my point of view. Anyway, sources say that the moment that Urban finishes his speech, people began literally ripping their cloaks into strips to basically fashion crosses to sew onto their clothing. And the response exceeds anything that Urban had ever planned for. He basically hoped to be able to recruit a couple knights, maybe a little squire over here, just send him over and, help with the Seljuk Turks. But instead, he got everyone on board. Now, here's an interesting little wrinkle. We don't actually know what Urban promised or precisely what he said Jerusalem had to do with any of this. His own surviving letter addressed to the faithful in Flanders doesn't mention Jerusalem at all. It only calls for help from, or basically for Eastern churches, and the Jerusalem framing and the Holy War and the apocalyptic imagery and all that stuff. That's what the crowds heard and what the chroniclers wrote down after the fact. There's a real and fascinating gap between what Urban officially preached, I guess, and what the people understood or heard and kind of how they interpreted the message. And no one's even really able to bridge the gap because we don't know exactly what he said. And the gap matters because it really shapes everything that goes forward, right? Now, why did they go? This is actually one of the most hotly debated questions about the Crusades, and it's worth pausing on it because the answer is not as simple as oh, well, they were just religious nut jobs. Of course they went over there. It's difficult to really understand. I mean, people go to war now for different reasons, so you can imagine it was just as complicated back then. The older, more scholarly kind of buttoned up library answer is basically associated with Jonathan Riley Smith. And he basically gives them the benefit of the doubt. He says, hey, look, their motivation came from sincere piety. Many of the Crusaders genuinely believed that they were performing this act of devotion and that the journey was some type of religious duty. This was kind of like a Catholic jihad, and that the indulgence was a reward that they were earnest about wanting. However, there's a new wave of scholarship, of course, right? A new wave coming from liberal colleges. Then you got people like Rubinstein, Tyerman, other people basically pushing back on the idea of the purely selfless faith and basically putting a real material incentive, conquering cities, looting, ambushing, a thirst for violence, becoming a lord of some small town along the way, all that stuff. But also there's another layer to the story, which is articulated specifically in Rubinstein's work. The layer of apocalyptic expectation. Now, this is, I think, relevant to the modern day. Basically, this is the end of the world theology in the church that if they march to Jerusalem, they might just start the end of the world. Sounds kind of familiar. I mean, we got bombs dropping on Tehran, and you got people in the military being like, hey, this is Armageddon time. How are we doing this again 1,000 years later? How dumb are we?
History always repeats itself.
It doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, as the great Mark Twain said.
I never understood that.
I think it's history schmistery, it's rhyming.
Okay.
No, that's not. It's it's not literally, it doesn't happen literally the exact same because this is not literally people marching from Europe going into Jerusalem. So it's not directly repeating itself, but there's elements that are so similar that you're this is functionally the same thing with some of the parameters tweaked. Hence the rhyme part.
Got it.
Anyway, Christos, look, the truth, almost with anything, is that all the motivations were probably true to some degree in different capacities for different people. I don't think there's one blanket you could put on for all of them. I mean, people go to the military now. You probably have an uncle. I mean, I have family in the military. Why are they there? Well, different people have different things. Some people are I got to go to college. Some people are I want to defend my country. Other people are I want to get a green card. If I fight in the military, I can get citizenship or something. I don't know exactly how that works, but I've heard people say that. Anyway, you can imagine a young kid with no inheritance and a taste for violence, and he's terrified of hell, but also he's kind of into adventure. All of a sudden you're all right, maybe this could be fun. And now you're dealing with real people rather than savages. Because I think people try to paint the Crusades issue as oh, you have these, these Seljuk Turks invading, these evil Muslims coming up to Europe. Oh, the horror. That's, all right. Really? You're going to just blame one side? And then you have other people a lot of modern academics being oh, these evil Christians and their thirst for blood and killing and da-da-da. And it's all right, really? We're going to do this? Both sides are unfortunately fully made of human beings that are remarkably flawed, that have a insatiable thirst for violence and destruction, but also have a capacity to love their kids and their families. And unfortunately, both things are true. I'm sorry. I know you wanted me to come on here and just be oh, this side's evil. This has never happened before in history. So I'm going to give you the honest truth, which is that things are nuanced and you're going to have to try to figure it out. And I know that's going to be hard, but it's going to be worth it. Anyway, Pope Urban had called for the official expedition to depart on August of 1096, giving him time for proper preparation. But he didn't count on guys like Peter the Hermit. Now, Who is Peter the Hermit? Can we get a picture of Peter the Hermit? Peter the Hermit is this charismatic preacher who basically wanders around. He's from northern France. He's this small, wafy-looking dude on a donkey. He's got no shoes. It's kind of how I feel like I would have looked like back in the day. And he basically just wandered around. He had no possessions at all, and crowds followed him everywhere that he went. People reportedly plucked hairs from his donkey as a relic. He had, by his own account, personally visited Jerusalem and received a divine letter from Jesus Christ himself instructing him to call for a crusade. Convenient. Before Urban's official army was ready to move, Peter had independently assembled an enormous militia, basically. Contemporary sources throw around figures from like 40,000, even over 100,000. All right, here's our man Peter the Great right there. Just looks like every ancient dude. Yeah, I thought that guy could be in the Bible.
That kind of looks like Homer to me. It also looks like a whole bunch of different people.
Aristotle, I think it's Aristotle. Maybe Socrates.
Yeah.
Like, basically, this dude that you're seeing right here had potentially an army of 70,000 people just walking around, ready to do whatever he said. All because he went to a place that was far away and had a letter from Jesus being like, "Dear Peter, please send an army to the Middle East." Now, medieval chroniclers were not doing head counts at the time, so no one really knows. But modern historians tend to suggest that there was probably tens of thousands of people. Regardless, the people in these armies were not knights, all right? They were peasants or, minor clergy like a deacon or something, or, an old man, a kid with a knife, a woman, wandering, misfits. There's no military training. He basically has like a ragtag group of like bums that are just following around and ready to bang. And they don't really have any food or like coherent leadership. They're just like ready to go. But they did have two major things. One, they had faith, which is very important. Two, they had weapons, arguably more important. Now, Urban's crusade might have technically been formed under the goal of helping the Byzantine Empire, sure. He's going to secure the Eastern Front. He's going to bring unity, to the church in the West. He's going to unite the East and the West, and all of a sudden he's going to be the Pope that brings it all together. Bang, he did it. But Peter's crusade was something different. And it was a little bit rogue. Peter the Hermit. So basically his army departed in the spring of 1096 and just kind of started destroying stuff. Everything, everyone. And Peter the Hermit's battalion, militia, whatever you want to call them, vigilantes, they were known as the People's Crusade. And they moved through the Rhineland, places like Worms, Mainz, Cologne. Bands within the movement attacked Jewish communities who had just kind of been living in like random villages. And the logic here is pretty strange. If they were marching to fight the enemies of Christ in Jerusalem, why would they pass over the enemies of Christ along the way? Right? I mean, that's their thought. They're like, hey, if we're going to go get the bad guys over there, well, let's just get the bad guys everywhere. While we're going, we might as well pick it up on, You're going home, you go to the drive-thru because it's on the way. That's basically why. So as a result, thousands of Jews were massacred. Entire communities were given the choice between conversion or death. A lot of them chose death. Many of them weren't even given a choice at all. Some reportedly died by suicide rather than convert. The whole thing is just a disaster. Truly. It's worth noting that not everyone stood by and just let it happen. A lot of bishops in several cities actively try to intervene and stop and be like, hey, can we not murder people? Like, what are we doing? In Cologne, the archbishop himself sheltered Jewish residents and attempted to protect them from the mobs. Now, these pogroms were the first act of violence that the Crusades produced, and that was long before they'd even made it to the Holy Land. This is like basically in Germany. I mean, this is just, their own neighbors. Now, real quick, for anyone wondering, the word that I used before, the pogrom, this is an organized attack of people in a specific ethnic or racial group. It's not technically a genocide, but it's essentially the same intentions. They just didn't really, they weren't that successful. And there's been a lot of pogroms throughout history. Pogroms. I hear it pronounced so many different ways.
Pogroms.
I don't want people to think I'm saying pilgrims.
Right.
Pogroms. And there's been a bunch of pogroms. I always hear them associated with like specifically attacking Jewish people. Like the Russian pogroms is like how I've heard it described. But technically it can just be any group. But yeah, I mean, that's what those are. Now, the People's Crusade marched through Hungary, the Balkans, and just they're attacking like Christian communities whose lands they went through because they ran out of food and they just needed to eat. So it's just the whole thing's a nightmare. Now, the Byzantines, to say the least, they were pissed. Alexios asked for soldiers, but instead they got like this massive mob of like old guys and weirdos with like swords and, pitchforks just pillaging the suburbs of Constantinople. So he shipped them across the Strait of Bosphorus as quickly as possible. And there, in Anatolia, with almost no military organization and, against the advice of every single person around him, Peter the Hermit's army marched into Seljuk territory. I mean, this feels like a Monty Python sketch. It feels like a bunch of people being like, we're going to defend the church. And they're like, with what army? And he's like, this army.
These crazy people.
Yeah. And he just turns around. It's just a bunch of like town drunks just like, Like, that's crazy that this is... And then the whole time the Pope is like, oh, brother. Who went over there? It's just, what a cluster. Anyway, the Seljuk Sultan, this guy, Kilij Arslan, the grandson of Alp Arslan, who actually crushed Romanos at that earlier battle, side note, he basically lets them come, and he lets them advance. And then at a place called Civitot, he swoops in and destroys them. I mean, you can hardly call it a battle. It was just literally like they just walked into a meat grinder. Thousands died. And those who survived, they were captured and then sold into slavery. So it didn't really work out for Peter the Hermit. It didn't work out for any of his buddies, the thousands, tens of thousands that rolled out with him. And Peter himself only survived because he had returned to Constantinople before the massacre started, and he eventually made his way back to Europe, where he later founded a monastery. And said, you know what? All this general life, not for me. I'm more of like a sit quietly and read a book type.
Same here.
Yeah. It's just tough that you guys see like 20,000 of your men get slaughtered before your eyes before you're like, you know what? I'm just going to just paint.
That'll do it though.
Yeah, that will definitely, that's a cold splash of water, And yeah, he just basically founds his monastery, and it's a very stark ending to the holy triumph that he had promised all the people that followed him. The People's Crusade was over in just a matter of weeks. But here's the thing to remember. The main army hadn't even left yet. So you have like the fake crusade, then you have the actual crusade. Now the real crusading force, what historians call the Prince's Crusade, because they kind of got beaten to the punch, they assemble through the spring and summer of 1096. And they start moving in August, just as Urban had planned. They didn't merge with the ragtag army, thank goodness. They were just sticking to their own kind of thing. They were like, yeah, we're not going to do fentanyl. All right, we're going to just deal with our own stuff. Now, the Prince's Crusade, despite being significantly more organized and structured than the People's Crusade, it was still not a perfectly unified army by any stretch. It was 4 separate forces from different parts of Europe with different leaders and languages and sometimes like competing ambitions. They were united by their crusading vows and almost nothing else. Their leaders, the guys who actually kept them focused and on track, they were probably the only reason that the Prince's Crusade made it as far as it did at all. So you have this guy, Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, led by a German Flemish contingent. He was very pious and personally very brave and widely respected. He was like the closest thing that the expedition actually had to a real leader, you could say. And he would become one of the movement's like defining sort of figures. And then there was Bohemond of Taranto, led the Normans from southern Italy, and he was the son of this guy, Robert Guiscard, this Norman warlord who had basically helped drive the Byzantines from Italy. Now, Bohemond was tall and scary and very ambitious, and he was really, really good with military tactics, and he also harbored a lot of personal hostility towards the Byzantines and the Byzantine Empire more broadly. I mean, he literally fought against the Byzantine Empire earlier in his career alongside his dad, and he came on Crusades for different, more personal reasons that I guess you could say weren't exactly in alignment with God. The third guy is Raymond of Toulouse, who led the largest army and the most supplied group of men coming from southern France. He was very old, in his late 50s, so sorry. And he was a very deeply devoted, pious man. He had already fought against Muslim invaders in Spain, so he also had a bit of a personal vendetta in his motivation. And he took this crusading business very seriously, and he sold much of his property before he ever left. And finally, with Raymond traveled the last guy, Adhemar Le Puy, a sort of a papal administrator. He was Pope Urban's personal representative on the expedition. He was the spiritual heart of the army. His authority was very moral rather than militaristic, and that made him in a lot of ways very powerful for this specific task in general. Now, These forces numbered somewhere between like 50 to 80,000 people, and it's worth being clear what this actually means, because the image of this crusading army as a column of armored knights on horseback, that's only a small part of it. The knights, the cavalry with the horses and all that stuff, those were like the shock troops of medieval Western warfare, and they were always a minority. And around them, you had an enormous ecosystem that was, that you wouldn't hear about or see in posters about the Crusades. You had foot soldiers and infantry, and they did a vast majority of the actual fighting and, of course, the dying. And then you had, clergy and chaplains who administered the sacraments and kept the spiritual machinery running. And then, of course, you have servants and craftsmen, and these are people that they're basically like the equipment managers of the Crusades. And then finally, a large population of non-combatant pilgrims. These are men and women who had taken the cross not as warriors, but as penitents. They were just following along in the cause because they wanted the indulgence to apply to them too. And so as a result, they started tagging along to Jerusalem and kind of treated it like a religious pilgrimage. Now, there was also a significant contingent of those whose origins we tend to overlook because history focuses on, obviously, like the famous princes, but there were thousands that came from Low Countries, from the Rhinelands, regions with their own cultures, languages, and all that stuff. And they also, play a role, right? Italian maritime cities started to actually matter at this point. So like Genoese and Pisan ships had been raiding Muslim ports in the Western Mediterranean for years, and joining the Crusade offered them two big incentives: commercial opportunity and, of course, the spiritual reward everyone's talking about, right? Gaining the Italian fleets would prove to be a huge asset for the movement. I mean, you can imagine how this would help with the whole campaign, but it was really essential in keeping the army connected to supply chains from Cyprus and the West. Now, Venice would actually get involved in some of the later Crusades, but that story is so crazy and dramatic and consequential that we'll get into that a different time with its own episode. What's up, guys? We're going to take a break really quick because privacy doesn't exist anymore. Nope. Everything you do on the internet is tracked. People can know what you're doing. I mean, targeted ads, AI training on everything we type, your data getting sold and passed around to all these different companies. And that's why I use ExpressVPN. And honestly, I use a VPN all the time. I just have it on. It just makes me feel better. I don't like thinking that everything that I'm Googling or talking about on the internet, every time I'm scrolling on Instagram, that it's getting tracked and sent to some company in order to create a profile on me. All right. And ExpressVPN is given the best deal ever. Basically, ExpressVPN is used for protecting your internet traffic. Also, just as like a little side note, it helps you access content in countries where it might not be available to you. So Netflix in America is different than Netflix in Europe. And with a VPN, you can access all the shows that they got over there. ExpressVPN also has some brand new features. They have Express AI. It's an encrypted AI chat, meaning what you say to the AI stays private. No storing, no training, no human reviewers. I can actually give AI the full picture without worrying that it's going to get sold to some company or it's in the hands of some private corporation. Also, Express Keys. This is a password manager, so you don't have to just rotate between the same 3 passwords you use for everything. Express Keys manages all of your passwords. And on top of that, MailGuard. This lets you sign up for stuff without handing over your real email, and then you're getting flooded with all sorts of, random offers and stuff like that. You're going to get all of that plus the best VPN in the world for the price of one membership. And that's when you're going to use ExpressVPN plus my link. That's CAMP, C-A-M-P. So if you want all of this, go to expressvpn.com/camp. That is expressvpn.com. Use the promo code CAMP and lock down your digital life. Get complete privacy on the internet. It's the last thing we have. Now let's get back to the show. Hey guys, we're going to take a break real quick because I got to tell you something that I'm actually stoked about. Now, if you know me, you know I love coffee. I love caffeine. I was also ripping nicotine pouches all the time, like sometimes going through like a pack a day. And honestly, I started to notice I was like a little wound up. Like my heart was racing. I was like kind of on edge, not sleeping great. I was like kind of anxious. And if you're into like, wellness and biohacking like I am, that's your body trying to tell you something. And that is why I love Ultra pouches. I reached out to them because I love the product. And before you ask, no, these are not a nicotine product. There's zero nicotine, technically no caffeine. What they are is a pouch loaded with nootropics and adaptogens, stuff like alpha GPC for mental sharpness, L-theanine for this calm focus, and Infinity PX, which gives you this clean, smooth energy that doesn't make you feel like you're going to explode. I still get like the ritual that I love. Like I just love taking a pouch out and trying it. Watermelon's actually my favorite flavor, but you don't get the anxiety spike or the withdrawal like you do with nicotine. And my sleep it's gotten a lot better, which if you know anything about recovery is the most important thing. I mean, these are legit. I keep them on the desk. I actually have one in right now. And if you've been thinking about, maybe using a little bit less nicotine, or you just want like a cleaner energy source than nicotine, you got to check out Ultra. And you're going to do it at takeultra.com, and you're going to use the code CAMP, C-A-M-P, for 15% off. That's takeultra.com/camp. And when they ask you about how you heard about us, tell them the good people at Camp Gagnon sent you. It really helps out the show. Now, let's get back to it. Back to the soldiers. The army converged on Constantinople through the winter of 1096 through 97. But the first serious crisis of the expedition wasn't even with the Muslims. It was with the guy who had asked them to come. So, let me explain. Basically, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was not dumb. He had asked for these Western mercenaries, but what arrived at the city walls was not that. It was something more powerful and probably equally or far less controllable, needless to say. These were not hired soldiers who were taking orders. These were these independent lords who owed him nothing, who had come in service to God and the Pope alone, who had their own ideas about what they were fighting for. You see, Alexios' plan was pretty straightforward, right? He wanted to recover Byzantine territory from the Seljuk Turks. This land had been Byzantine for centuries. You had Antioch and Anatolia, or a lot of Anatolia, and then they have this one battle, and they lose a lot of it, and he just needs some guys from the western states to come over and get the land back for Constantinople. Come on, right? It's easy. These are my cities, these are my provinces, this is my empire, and I just need help getting it back. Now, the Crusaders and the Crusader leaders had a very different idea of what they were doing. They had come to liberate Jerusalem, and they needed to secure their indulgences to get to heaven. Any territory they took with their own swords, they felt like it was theirs. And the tension now was immediate. Like you could imagine you hire like a mercenary force and they think that the stuff that they plunder is for them. When you're like, no, this is for me, I'm paying you. And that's the whole deal. Now, some of the Crusader leaders camped outside Constantinople and began raiding the suburbs when supply negotiations broke down. One guy, this dude Tancred, Bohemon's ambitious nephew, he refused to ever enter the city at all, and he crossed over to Anatolia rather than deal with Alexios. But Alexios was a skilled diplomat. One by one, he brought the Crusader leaders into Constantinople, and he received them in this magnificent ceremony and this whole imperial ball. There was a big to-do. And most of these Western knights never seen anything like this, and basically extracted from them an oath that they would return to Byzantine authority any and all of the former Byzantine land that they covered. Like, hey, we're going to wine you and dine you, give you a couple shots, and he's like, by the way, anything you get is mine, right? We're cool with this? And most of them swore the oath, but how sincerely they swore it, well, it's a different story. For example, Bohemond swore, but he had no intention of keeping his word at all. After their pause at Constantinople and their rift with Alexios, the army just kept on marching. They crossed the Strait of the Bosphorus and over into Anatolia in spring of 1097. Now, this was the leg of the journey that would ultimately take them to Jerusalem. They had no real idea how long it would take. Many probably thought that they would be in Jerusalem within months, but it ended up taking them 2.5 years. Yeah. Now, the first objective on their list along the way was Nicaea. Now, you probably heard of this from the Council of Nicaea. This is an ancient city of course, the Great Church Councils. And now, it is also the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Kilij Arslan, the same sultan who had wiped out the People's Crusade, was not terribly worried about this new crusade that was coming through at first. He had left most of his army elsewhere fighting another campaign, but he came back real quick and realized that he was very mistaken. This army was not like the People's Crusade. This was like a real army. And at the Battle of Dorylaeum in June of 1097, Kilij Arslan hit the crusading army just with everything he had. Bohemond's vanguard took the initial shock of the attack, and there were thousands of Seljuk cavalry swarming around the flanks and then raining arrows. It was just crazy. They were victim to a distinctive Turkish fighting style, the feigning retreat and then the sudden counterattack. The Crusaders were trained in the heavy cavalry charge of Western European warfare. They had never seen anything like this ever. And the battle was just kind of 50-50 for hours. Then the rest of the army arrived. And the sheer number of crusaders just overwhelmed the Seljuks. And so Kilij Arslan's forces were broken and scattered, and this decisive victory opened the road through Anatolia. But again, that doesn't mean that it was just easy after that. The road through Anatolia was itself like just a slow-motion train wreck. It was summertime, and the Seljuks, who had retreated, they adopted this scorched earth attack. They poisoned wells and burned crops, and they drove off livestock, and they just tried to make the land completely unlivable. So the Crusaders marched through a complete wasteland in temperatures that could exceed 100 degrees, like wearing like heavy armor, and their horses were dying of heat stroke, and people were getting dysentery and dying of thirst. I mean, it's extremely graphic. But some accounts describe men so desperate for water that they literally cut open the bodies of the horses and drank the water from their stomachs. And they continued to march. Now, in October of 1097, what remained of this enormous force crossed the mountains into Syria and arrived outside the walls of Antioch. Now, Antioch was one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. It was once the third largest city in the entirety of the Roman Empire, coming in only after Rome and Alexandria. But in 1097, it was held by the Seljuk garrison under a commander named Yankhi Siyan. Now, this guy would basically receive word of the Crusaders' approach and was very well prepared. He was like, all right, these Crusaders want some, I got it. Now, the walls of Antioch were massive. This was miles of fortification with towers cutting across difficult, rugged terrain. Taking it by direct assault was impossible. So the Crusaders had a different approach, and they settled for a siege. Now, a siege is different than actually seizing a town. This siege basically lasts a super long time, and by every measure, it was a nightmare, as most sieges are. Basically, the Crusaders stripped the surrounding countryside bare within weeks, and resupply from the coast was unreliable, so food ran out. Now, starvation is a constant issue. People are deserting in the thousands. Major figures are starting to abandon the camp. You have Stephen of Blois, who is one of the leading lords. He declared the expedition completely hopeless in a letter to his wife, and he left for home in February of 1098. He would later return completely just destitute and in shame when he heard about what happened next. While the Crusaders were withstanding the siege, a massive Muslim relief army was forming. Now, Kurgaba of Mosul, one of the most powerful commanders in the region, was marching toward Antioch with a force that vastly outnumbered the Crusader army. And they're moving quick, and the time was running out. And then something extraordinary happened. The kind of thing that makes you kind of wonder, like what's going on in history? Is it just luck? Is it God? Like, what's actually happening? Our boy Bohemond, that ambitious Norman who had sworn an oath to Alexios but never actually wanted to keep the oath, he had been quietly negotiating with a man inside Antioch, an Armenian convert to Islam named Firuz, and he had commanded one of the city's towers and had a personal grievance against the leader of Antioch. And Bohemond finally got Firuz to open the tower. Crazy as it sounds, that's all it took. Now, on the night of June 2nd, 1098, going into June 3rd, Bohemond's men scaled the walls in darkness. The tower was then opened from within, and the Crusaders just poured into the city. The garrison was massacred. The Crusaders had officially captured Antioch, and 3 days later, Carbaga's army pulled up and surrounded them. Now, the people that were sieging the city, they themselves were now being sieged. But there's one more thing worth noting before we get into what happens next. During the long months of the Antioch siege, you have a separate remarkable drama that was unfolding a little bit farther north. Godfrey's brother, Baldwin of Boulogne, had broken away from the main army completely. He basically just marched east into the region of Edessa, this Armenian Christian city where the local ruler, desperate for some type of protection, essentially adopted Baldwin as the heir to his throne. Now, in March of 1098, Baldwin seized control of Edessa outright, and the county of Edessa became the first Crusader state, established not by some big strategy, but by one guy just basically seeing an opportunity and being like, yeah, I'll be the heir, and then getting in and being like, yeah, I'll just be the king right now. Now, the rest of the army was still fighting just to survive at Antioch. This guy basically just walks off and then becomes like the ruler of his own little fiefdom. I mean, it's crazy, and no one ever brings up that part. But anyway, here's where things get truly crazy, because what follows is one of the most remarkable episodes, not just in the First Crusade, but in the history of medieval warfare, the history of warfare in general. Basically, despite their recent win capturing Antioch, The Crusaders were emotionally destroyed. Their morale had plummeted. They were trapped inside the city, outnumbered with a massive enemy army surrounding them. And they were getting diseases, and they were sick, and they were tired. I mean, people are dying every day. You have several leaders that are secretly negotiating their own escape. And by any rational military assessment, the expedition was done. But then there's a peasant, this guy Peter Bartholomew, that comes forward with a new vision. Here's what he says. He claimed that St. Andrew, the apostle, had appeared to him multiple times and had revealed the location of the Holy Lance. Yes, the Holy Lance, the spear of Longinus. This is literally the spear that pierced the side of Christ at the crucifixion. St. Andrew told him that it was buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter in Antioch. What? Now, as you can imagine, people were divided. You have Adhemar of Lipoi that, basically was like, all right, this is crazy. This is like the spiritual leader, by the way, that's traveling with them. Adhemar was like, that's insane. He had heard the story of the Holy Lance before, but there was already a claimed Holy Lance that was in Constantinople. Raymond of Toulouse, on the other hand, he was like, no, he's telling the truth. And at least he found it, strategically useful to believe it. It might have been beneficial to give the people something to hope for. So they went in, and men took turns digging away in the pit beneath the cathedral floor, and for a long time there was nothing. The crowd that had gathered started to grow restless, and then Peter Bartholomew reportedly himself jumped into the pit and emerged holding a piece of metal that he declared was the Holy Lance. This is a story that is allegedly fully true. Now, is it actually the Holy Lance? Probably not. I mean, the object that Peter produced was probably like a Roman artifact that had been buried there. Adhemar remains very skeptical, but here's the thing. It doesn't really matter. The effect that this discovery has on the army is electrifying. I mean, it's just a lightning bolt straight to the hearts of every single person in the army, and they're like, you know what? We got this. You see, in the theology of that time, physical objects that were associated with the Passion of Christ, they were considered to have immense spiritual power. I mean, even to this day, people consider like the Holy Lance or like the Shroud of Turin, things like that, as deeply important religious artifacts. Now, possessing the Holy Lance was essentially equal to like having like the cosign of God, right? Like you carry that thing into battle, you have divine protection. You're fighting under the jersey of the Holy One. And at that point, that's exactly what the army needed. And on June 28th, 1098, the Crusaders opened the gates of Antioch and marched out to fight Kerboga's vastly larger force. They marched out in organized formation. You have clergy walking among them, and the Holy Lance was carried in the front of the column. Now, Kerboga chose, for reasons that are still very debated, not to attack immediately. They came out and he didn't go for them. Maybe this was like a retreat tactic. Regardless, it just wound up being a critical mistake. He expected some type of negotiation or perhaps wanted to let them, fully commit before he cut them off. No one knows. But by the time that his army was engaged, the Crusaders had already formed their battle lines. Now, Kerboga's coalition army began to fragment right away. When the initial charges went unexpectedly bad, they didn't know what to do. His army was large in number, but they had been assembled from, again, multiple Muslim lords. This is kind of the same issue that the Crusaders had. And all of these different Muslim lords had different priorities, and they didn't really have a ton of loyalty to each other. So they weren't exactly tight-knit groups, and so units started to retreat, and others started to advance, and within hours, Kerboga's force was in full flight. The Crusaders had won a battle that they absolutely had no right to win. And interestingly enough, Peter Bartholomew would later submit to a trial by ordeal to prove that his vision was legit, walking through fire with the lance in his hands. They literally tried to test his visions. They're like, hey, if you believe this so much, walk through the fire holding this, holy lance. And he survived the fire. But then he died of his burns 12 days later. And history never really made up its mind on what this guy is. Like, was he just a crazy person? Was he like legit? Like, why didn't he get like Joan of Arc status? Like, he low-key won the siege of Antioch for the Crusaders. It's a crazy side story. Look up this guy, Peter Bartholomew. The victory at Antioch should have been followed immediately by a march south to Jerusalem, right? I mean, they're on the way. They got this town. They got some money. They got some morale. Just go down there. But they didn't, because all of a sudden, Bohemond had no intention of leaving. You see, he had negotiated the entry into Antioch. He had, in his view, won it with his own cunning and strategy, and he informed the other leaders very politely and then less politely, hey, by the way, guys, Antioch, this is mine now. This is all mine. That oath to Alexios, yeah, we're not doing that. The city's not going back to the Byzantine Empire, Byzantium. This is mine. Now, Raymond of Toulouse, very pious, he furiously objected, and the other leaders basically argued, and the army sat in Antioch through the summer into the autumn, hemorrhaging men to disease and, desertion, while the commanders are basically, quarreling. And then Adhemar of Lipoi finally died of the plague in 1098. And now the moral authority of the entire expedition is just gone. There's no longer this peacekeeping person for all the leaders to defer to. Meanwhile, the ordinary soldiers and the pilgrims were losing patience. They had not marched all the way to France just to sit in Syria somewhere, and they began pressuring their leaders, some threatening to tear down the walls of Antioch if it meant forcing a departure. And at that point, the rank and file were in some ways driving the expedition more than the princes were even at that point. You had like a mutiny or like a rebellion of your own soldiers. And then in January of 1099, the army finally went south, but not before it committed one of the darkest acts of the entire crusade. This is at Marat al-Numan, a town south of Antioch that had been besieged and taken in December of 1098. The food situation at this point for the Crusaders was so desperate that they began to eat the dead. This, unfortunately, is difficult to really know, but it seems like by most contemporary sources, it's not legend or enemy propaganda. It's attested in a lot of different sources, including accounts written by Crusaders themselves. Contemporary chronicler Radulf of Caen wrote with a lot of directness about what he saw. And this is kind of graphic, so if you don't want to hear this, you can fast forward. But the Crusaders reportedly boiled human beings, sometimes old and sometimes young. Yeah, and the sources are pretty clear on this. The historians have no reason to not accept it as it is, and it remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the entire story. Now, the army that marched south from Marat in January of 1099, they were very much diminished. I mean, perhaps 15,000 fighters remained from the original force, down from somewhere between like 60 to 80,000. They crossed through Syria and into Palestine through the spring of 1099, moving faster than anyone could have expected, bypassing fortified towns when they could, negotiating passage from local rulers who often preferred to let them pass rather than bother fighting. The Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, who had recently taken Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks, they sent envoys offering a deal that would allow pilgrims safe access to Jerusalem's holy sites. But the Crusaders said, nah, we didn't siege some towns and eat human beings and go on the road for 2.5 years to strike a deal. So they said, you know what? It's wartime. On June 7th of 1099, some of the advancing Crusader soldiers that were at the very front lines, they crested a ridge and they saw Jerusalem for the very first time. The chroniclers record that grown men were weeping. Knights dismounted their horses, and they walked forward barefoot. And the crowd basically fell to its knees in the dust and just prayed. I mean, they had walked 3,000 miles for nearly 3 years, and they finally made it. Now, Jerusalem in June of 1099 was held by a Fatimid governor named Iftikhar ad-Dawla, and he had been well informed about the Crusaders' approach and had, once again, prepared very carefully. He expelled the city's Christian population in case that they might be sympathizers, and he poisoned or blocked the wells outside the walls. He had reinforced the garrison, and he sent urgent requests to Cairo for backup. Now, the relief army from Egypt was real, and it was coming quickly. And the Crusaders knew this. They estimated that they had, at most, a few weeks. The city's walls were formidable, not as big as Antioch's, but well-maintained and defended by very experienced soldiers. And the first assault attempt was on June 13th, just days after the army arrived, and it was beaten back. The Crusaders lacked adequate siege equipment because they had been marching, not building or actually, setting up for any type of siege warfare. The situation deteriorated immediately. The summer heat in Jerusalem was brutal. The wells outside the city were poisoned. The nearest reliable water source was miles away. And once again, every day, men and horses were just dying of thirst. Food was running short again, and somewhere to the south, the Fatimid relief army was steadily getting closer. Now, the Crusader army was saved partially by ships. Remember those fleets we were talking about before? The Genoese fleet that sailed out? They got into the port of Jaffa with supplies and, crucially, with shipbuilders and the materials needed to construct siege equipment. This is an extraordinary feat of logistics. The Crusaders dismantled the ships and hauled the timber overland to Jerusalem. and they worked in the heat under constant harassment from the garrison. They built these 2 massive siege towers and the necessary equipment to assault the walls. I mean, straight up just like they just did Fortnite. Like they disassembled the whole ship, built the tower up, got their arrows ready, got the horses fed, and they were like, all right, we're good to go. Now the final assault began on July 13th of 1099, and for 2 days, the Crusaders pushed their siege towers towards the walls under just a barrage of arrows and fire and heavy stones, and there's the people on the other side of the wall just dumping stuff on them. The defenders fought brilliantly. The first tower to reach the walls was on the north side, commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon. Now, on the afternoon of July 15th, his men managed to lower a drawbridge from the top of the tower into the city wall. And the very first crusader crossed into Jerusalem after years on foot. Now, what follows next is one of the most documented and disturbing events, maybe in medieval history. The Crusaders sacked Jerusalem for 2 days. The Muslim population of the city was killed. I mean, the whole population, really. Men, women, children. And accounts are pretty explicit and on both sides. The Jewish population, who had reportedly joined the Muslim garrison in defending the walls, they were also killed in their synagogues when they took shelter. And the killing was not selective or confined to combatants. It was pretty systemic. Ifkhtar ad-Dawla himself was granted safe passage. Raymond of Toulouse spared him and his personal guard in exchange for surrender of the Tower of David, the main citadel. And he walked out of Jerusalem alive and eventually made his way to Egypt. And he's one of the few survivors of this military force or this garrison in Jerusalem at all. The sources on the massacre are plentiful and consistent across both Christian and Muslim accounts. The chronicler Raymond of Aguirre, a crusader, described men just walking in blood up to their ankles or up to the bridle reins of their horses, as he wrote. Scholars debate whether this is hyperbole. Maybe he's being serious. Maybe the drainage isn't that good. Maybe this is like referencing some type of like biblical metaphor, which basically says the same thing. But the underlying reality of the violence is not really in question on this one. There's a genuine, historiographical argument about the scale of this death and the violence here relative to the norms of medieval warfare. And the rules of siege warfare in this period, broadly understood by both sides, held that a city that refused to surrender and was taken by storm could be subject to massacre. Now, Ifkhtar had refused all negotiations, so in that context, what the Crusaders did was not uniquely, aberrant by the standards of the age. I mean, Muslim armies, Byzantine armies, Christian armies had all done comparable things, but the thing is, and again, I don't want to defend the massacre of Jerusalem, but the thing is, the context, while historically important, it doesn't really make you feel any better, right? Like, yeah, sure, like, if the people said no to a siege, like your whole town could get massacred, like that's part of it. It's like, all right, everyone was doing it, sure. But also the idea of like thousands of human beings, walking for miles and murdering thousands of other human beings in 2 days. And many of those the people that did the killing, they were genuinely and completely compelled that God had led them to this place and that what they were doing was holy. I mean, that's a tough deal, right? When you think that what you're doing is commanded by God, so you're willing to overlook like the systemic massacre of thousands of your own human beings. Not great. Now, that collision between sincere, misguided faith and catastrophic violence is one of the most important things that the First Crusade forces us to confront, and unfortunately has kind of happened time and time since. Now, 1 week after the massacre, on July 22nd, 1099, the Crusaders' leaders gathered to decide who would rule Jerusalem. The obvious choice here was Raymond of Toulouse, the most senior noble. He was the most devout. He had been there the whole time. He sacrificed the most, and he was ultimately offered the crown of Jerusalem. But crazily enough, he refused it. He would not, he said, wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. I'll be honest, Raymond of Toulouse, kind of like the sickest guy of this whole thing. I don't know everything about him. I've never read a whole book on him. But just based off of the research that we've done for this episode, he's kind of sick.
But the Pope's kind of the accelerant of all of it.
No, the Pope does the whole thing, of course. But I'm saying Raymond of Toulouse is just like, I have a good life, I'm a noble, but I'm going to give it all up to fight for God. And then they try to make him the king, and he's like, nah, there's only one king. Christ is king.
Oh, you're saying he's the most noble
Yeah, what do you think I was saying?
Oh, he was, the worst guy out of all of it.
No, he's like the most, like, he's like a G. Is that what I said? I meant to say, like, he was like the sickest dude.
Oh, you said sickest, and I thought like bad sick.
No, he's like a bro.
Sure.
Christ is king. I mean, maybe he did some terrible stuff. He probably massacred some people in the massacre of Jerusalem, which wasn't good.
He must have.
Maybe he just was like, guys, stop. Did you ever think about that? Maybe he was like, guys, can we stop? He might have said, I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know what you want me to say. Now, historians will debate this topic. They'll be like, was this genuine piety? Was he really like, oh, like Christ is king? Or was this like a strategic thing? Honestly, both men's motivations here are genuinely contested. Like, either way. Godfrey of Bouillon, who was elected instead, not as king, but as the title of Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He accepted, and it's worth noting that even his title is a little murky in the historical record. He seems to have used a more ambiguous term, princeps, like prince, in his own documents, and the grandeur, the defender framing came largely from others writing about him later. But Godfrey had less than a year to enjoy his new title. He died in July of 1100, probably of illness, so his brother Baldwin then succeeded him and took the royal title that the Crusaders had previously been too pious to give to Godfrey. The Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the County of Edessa, and the Principality of Antioch now had to be defended and governed. All of this was now taken and expanded for, the Romans, the Roman Empire. They were tiny Christian islands in a vastly Muslim world, dependent on a steady stream of reinforcements and supplies from Europe that were never really that reliable. Bohemond kept Antioch, as he intended all along, and of course, Byzantine Emperor Alexios never forgave him and was pissed, and the relationship between Byzantium and the Crusaders, which was already, fraught, deteriorated into open hostility over the following decades. Now, within weeks of Jerusalem's fall, the Fatimid relief army from Egypt showed up, and they arrived at Ashkelon. The Crusaders somehow also beat them too, a victory that absolutely secured their hold on the coast. But it was just a preview of what the next 2 centuries would basically look like. This constant grinding military struggle to keep hold of what they had taken or taken back, depending on who you ask. They had certainly made a lot of enemies along the way. And the society or the circumstances that the first crusade was, created from was now reshaping itself in response. On the Muslim side, the First Crusade was less of a civilizational shock than it was a regional military problem. And to be honest, a huge reason as to why the Crusaders succeeded was because of how fractured the Muslim world actually was in 1099. It wasn't one unified monolith. It was, several, and they were actively hostile to each other. You had the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo, and that was Shia, and then you have the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. They were Sunni, and then there was, they were effectively a puppet of the Seljuk Turks also, and at the same time, the Seljuks themselves, they were fragmenting within. You have the great Seljuk Sultanate, who had won the Massacre in 1071. That splintered into a semi-independent regional power. It's a whole thing. All you need to know is that they were at each other's necks, and they were fractured, and they were a little bit more fractured than the Crusaders, who at the very least had formed into one unified army by the time they got there. These were essentially warlords who they nominally served the Sultan, but they had their own agendas. Just kind of like the Crusaders, right? You have, different Crusader nobles that are like, hey, Antioch, this is mine now. Now, in the wake of this Crusader destruction, the long-term Muslim response would be gradual, and it became this consolidation of Sunni military power. And you had many leaders who eventually unified Egypt and Syria under a single command. And then eventually you have Saladin, who actually retakes Jerusalem in 1187. This is a process that takes nearly 90 years, literally 90 years of buildup to try to go retake this land that was at one point taken from them. And it required the Muslim world to overcome the exact same political fragmentation that actually allowed the First Crusade to succeed in the first place. But what happens after this is an episode all into itself. But now what makes the story of 1096 to 1099 so crazy, and kind of what I take away from it, is the gap, the vast, just insane gap between what these people believed they were accomplishing and what they actually did. They somehow It's like crazy, just like the game of telephone. You have this commander, Alexios, that's like, hey, I need some soldiers to come fight for me. And then the Pope's like, you know what? We are going to get those soldiers, and also we're going to take the Holy Land, and also you guys are all going to get indulgences. And then all these people think that they're liberating the holy city of Jerusalem. They think they're acting in God's name. Some of them believed. Some of them, they thought that the suffering and the killing was sanctified by the destination. And when they arrived and wept at the sight of Jerusalem's walls and then crossed those walls and began to kill, I mean, we're watching human beings do what human beings do, which is unfortunately hold two contradictory things inside themselves, right? I mean, this happens all the time. Whether it's like a radical Muslim guy that kills a bunch of people in the name of Allah, like every Muslim I know is like, yeah, that's crazy. And in the same way, if you're Catholic or Christian reading this, you're probably like, oh, people did that in the name of Christ? Like, that's not good. And so, of course, you have people that are reading the same holy text as you, and then they go and do terrible things, and you're like, how is it possible that they were able to put these two things together and think that they made sense? Now, the effect of the First Crusade did not end in 1099. They are still echoing across countries in religious history to this day in some ways. Like the fault lines it carved between faiths and civilizations, the language of holy war that introduced into the vocabulary of the medieval world. I mean, it really like changed the framework of the entire world. They are a part of the architecture that we still live in. And the crazy thing is that even the scale of the Crusades was enormous and the effects of it would last for centuries. Misguided religious expeditions still happen now. People in the modern day still have a belief that their God wants them to dominate others in their God's name, and the consequences might not be as dire. Maybe they are, but maybe it's not as brutal as the Jerusalem Massacre. But regardless, people can be deceived into doing horrible, monstrous things, and we look at the Crusades like, oh man, this is medieval, barbaric warfare. Then they were doing what God wants. It's like, yeah, that stuff still kind of happens. That's what's crazy. And this idea of like, yeah, it's what God wants. Manifest destiny. They go take over and conquer all of America because this is what God wants, right? That brings us to that roaring chant that defined the Crusades. Deus vult, God wills it. And in a way, that became the slogan that changed everything. Now that is just an abridged understanding of the First Crusades. I mean, truly a fascinating look into history. I think just a few things to make clear. This is not like one side good, one side bad, right? Like this is human beings doing what human beings do. And I'm sure the Seljuk Turks, they took land that wasn't theirs, but they were like, we're going to expand the Muslim world and we're going to make more people Muslim, get them into Jannah, and this is what we should do. And then, of course, you have the response from the Catholics. They're like, you know what? We're going to go take it back. We're going to actually take back more than they took because why the heck not? Because greed and ultimately the insatiable desire for conquest that sits in the hearts of all men, it's never quenched. And so it's just another unfortunate telling of history, but we should be looking at these things to say, hey, maybe history shouldn't repeat itself. Maybe we don't need to go on a conquest spree and try to subjugate other people to conform to our ideas. Of course, you should protect the vulnerable, protect the weak.
Crazy that it's about Jerusalem, and that seems to be a powder keg for a whole bunch of different groups.
Yeah, it turns out being like the hotbed for every religion is put a real target on your back, Everyone wants a piece, right?
Yep.
Like, it's crazy to think that, like, had Jerusalem just been like, I don't know, New Paltz, New York, that this would just be like the site of like so much pilgrimage and beauty and destruction and violence. It's just crazy. I don't know. All I can say is, let's just, like, what are we doing? Right? God doesn't want you to murder everyone. Probably not. I don't know of any God that's like that. I don't think Brahma's like that. I don't think Vishnavite devotion and a devotion to Vishnu is like that. I don't think Allah is like that. I don't think Hashem or Yahweh. Maybe Yahweh. You read some stuff in the Old Testament, you're like, man, they did what to the Canaanites? That's not good. Well, let's just let bygones be bygones, right?
What about Ares, the god of war?
Is Ares the god of war, or is Ares the god of defense?
The great god of war and courage.
That's your god.
That's one of the Greek gods.
That's one of your gods. That's like what you believe.
Well, Greeks don't believe in every single Greek god.
Oh, that's convenient. What gods do you believe in, Christos?
The one and only.
Zeus.
Whoever you guys believe.
Respect. I don't know. What do you guys think? Is there anything I missed? Again, I'm not a historian. I just want to make that clear. I'm just a comedian that's insatiably curious with a Wi-Fi connection. And I got a couple of friends that help me do research on this stuff, and they pepper me with information, and I try to explain it to you guys as best I can. So if I miss anything, please don't hesitate to let me know. Please drop a comment. I read all of them, YouTube, Spotify, all that good stuff. Also, if you like religious content, specifically the theology of different religions from around the world, great news. We have Religion Camp. You can check that out. In the description, we also have Camp Gagnon. That's the main channel. That's where we talk about what's going on right now, right? Religion Camp is what's going to happen in the future. Where do people think that we go? What do they believe? Camp Gagnon is what's going on right now. What are some of the current conspiracies and crazy stories we can talk about today? And then, of course, History Camp is trying to understand everything that's ever happened. And good news, we also have the Campfire. This is the Inner Sanctum. This is the Patreon, patreon.com/CampGagnon. That's where we do lives every single month, extra episodes, ad-free episodes, and you get to chit-chat with Christos Papadopoulos himself.
Please sign up because I just did my taxes and the tax man cometh.
Yeah, you need this.
Yeah.
You need this big time.
When you make as much money as I do, you pay a lot in taxes.
Yeah, right? It's a whole thing. They just rinse you.
It's unreal.
You got to go offshore.
I got to go talk to Pete Hegseth.
Yeah, exactly. Go to Switzerland or something. Maybe Panama. Anyway, please let me know what you guys think. Drop a comment. I go through all of them. And if you just rock with us here at History Camp, great news. We drop these episodes every single week. And I will see you in the future to talk about the past. God bless. I'll see you next time.